T. Clark here, and this video is about the written response prompt 3B for the create performance task. So what you have to do is you have to capture and paste two program code segments that you developed during the administration of this task and that contain a list or other collection type that is used to manage complexity in your program. So the first code segment must show the data stored in the list. The second program code segment must show the data in the same list being used. So the caveat is the data being used must be the same from the same list as in part I. The data in part II must be used as part of fulfilling the program's purpose. So the data abstraction must make the program easier to develop, where the alternatives would be more complex, or easier to maintain, where future changes to the size of the list would otherwise require significant modifications to the program code. Okay, the other requirements for the written response, the prompts you have to answer are, the first one is identify the name of the list being used, super easy. IV is, the fourth one is describe what the list data represents in your program. And 5 is explains how the selected list manages complexity in your program code by explaining why your program code could not be written or how your program code could be written differently if you did not use the list. Okay, so the left one is abbreviated. I think I need to finish this up. I think I'll add to this so that's the whole prompt. Okay, and it must be approximately 200 words. So yeah, there's 5 prompts, but 2 of them are just code that doesn't count towards the word. Okay, so the scoring, again, I was going to check those 2 program code segments and make sure you identify the name and describe what the data is. So that's 1 point. Point 2, row 2 is that point. So you don't get a point if the use of the list is trivial and does not assist in fulfilling the program's purpose. So if you just have a list for a list and you print out 1 through 10 maybe, and that has nothing to do with your program, that's worthless. So it has to be something that helps your program. Okay, so this is 2 points. The second point, or the third total point, but the second point for 3B is looking at the program code in part 2 and the written response in part 5. And even if you didn't get the point in parts 2, so if you messed up 1 and 3 and 4 and you didn't have 100% and you did not get that point, you can still get the point for part 3. Okay, but you will not get a point if they're separate lists, if they're not included, if you didn't name it, if the use of the list is irrelevant, like I said, the explanation does not match the code, the explanation is implausible, inaccurate, or inconsistent, so it doesn't match the program. The solution without the list is not a real solution, so you're just making stuff up saying, oh, it's better because the other way is impossible, or the other way is you make up a tale that's not really real. You'd lose a point, or you wouldn't get the point if it doesn't help the program be easier to develop, meaning that alternatives are as easy or easier to do without a list. And you don't get the point if the list does not result in the program that is easier to maintain, meaning future changes to the size of the list would cause significant modifications to the code. Okay, so my hints: name your list. Easy way to lose points is simply forgetting to say the name of the list. And it actually has a whole separate fill-in box for it, so it's not too bad to have the name of the list. It's easy to have 2 different lists, so make sure you're using the same list in all the 5 responses. So only include 2 code segments. So I want a bunch of code segments. I just want to have the initialization or data stored, and then the data being used. So don't simply say that you have to use variables. So if you say, oh, if I didn't have to use a list, I'd have to use variables. Duh. But you have to give more details. Why is using variables, maybe 20 variables, maybe 50 variables, why is that managing complexity if I just use a list instead? So give more details, be specific about variables. I'd have to use variable 1, x1, x2, x3, x4, x5, x6, so on and so forth, and then what they'd have to store, and then it'd be probably impossible to develop your program without a list. but be specific in saying why it would be impossible and how you change it to use variables, and then how it would be impossible to make it work that way. So even though the list is good and your code is good, so you have great code in part 1 and 2, but you don't explain it, that would not be a good idea. So make sure you know how to explain your code and how it manages complexity in your code. So there's a checklist and the same stuff. Okay, so let's get to work on it. Oh, what the heck? So on my code, I have a list that represents the grid. So there's my list and grid. So I'm going to do a screenshot. So if you don't know how to take, taking a screenshot, apparently I don't know how to take a screenshot because I'm using a different macro set with Screencastify, and my normal take a screenshot key on my mouse is the same as stop Screencastify. So I can't do my macro, so I have to actually do Windows key Shift S, and I box it up. And there we go. And if you don't know how to take a screenshot, I have a link to a site that shows you how, or just Google it. How do I take a screenshot with whatever device I have, Chromebook or whatever. And then I took a screenshot, and then I right away, before I do anything else, I go to the box and paste it in. Or you might have to open up Paint and paste it there, crop it, because I think you have to save it as an image and upload the image. That's the way they're going to do it. So yeah, you can take a screenshot, but you'll have to save it as an image somehow. So you can open up Google Drawing, paste it in there, download it as a PNG or a JPEG, depending on what the College Board digital portfolio accepts. So you take a screenshot, but I recommend putting it in this template. That way you can see it as you write about it. So I'm going to put in the template anyway. Okay, and then the next screenshot, let's see, what do I have to do? I have to have the program code showing data in the same list being used, such as creating new data from the existing data or accessing multiple elements in the list. Okay, so if you have a loop, so I have my list is a list of lists of numbers. So it's a 2D array. So it is still a list because it's a list of lists, and that's going to be used in the initialize course. So I'm going to use that list to say make the boxes. So I have this whole code all the way down to draw boxes. I'm going to make it so I can have that all in one screenshot. Okay, so then I screenshot. Let's not use my macro this time. Let's screenshot it. And I want to get that width and height up there because it's using the first elements or the lengths. Yeah, the lengths of the list to get the dimensions that are used in the draw box down at the bottom. Okay, paste it here or save it as a picture or both. Okay, so I have, and I like to get the line numbers. That way when I'm writing about it, I can reference and say, okay, line whatever, line, it starts on line 86 and goes to line 97. And I have the dimensions from 84 and 85 or whatever. Okay, so I want to have the name of the list. Name of the list, simple, grid, done. Type it in, grid. You can make it fancy if you want. You don't have to. I don't think they care anymore. But if they want a monospace font, it doesn't really matter. My two fonts look kind of similar. Oh, not too much. So grid is monospace. Okay, so 3 is simple. 4, describe what the data contained in the list represents in your program. Okay, so in my program, what does it do? The data in the list grid. So I'm going to still use the variable name, the list name, in my response for 4. Even though I have it in 3, I'm going to keep using that word or that variable name again and again. So what does it have? It contains, it has rows of numbers, and makes it 2D. I'm not going to use the word matrix. I could use matrix. Or I'll just use a collection. So that's the word that you're using in the prompt, collection. So I'll just say a 2D collection. And each number, so I have numbers in the 0, 2, 3, and so on, and actually the keys on line 39. So I'll say each number represents a box, and whether that box in the grid is open, blocked, goal or the start. I'll say with a comment on line 39, specifying the valid values. Okay, double check, make sure you read it correctly. Okay, it represents, what does it represent? That's a keyword from the prompt. Represents, okay, it represents a box, and whether that box is okay. Okay, looks good. Okay, part 4 says to explain how the selected list manages complexity by explaining why your program code could not be written. Okay, so I'm going to say that in my code on line 86 to 97, the code loops over the rows and columns of grid. Again, keep using the variable name grid to draw each box based on the corresponding number in the grid. Okay, so it checks all this stuff. Okay, so yeah. Without the list, the programmer would have to draw each box with a specific color and specific coordinates that were pre-planned and not dynamically from the loop. So on line 97, the drawBox function is called, giving it coordinates to match the dimensions as well as the row and column numbers in the grid. Okay, so I'm saying it's dynamic because these equations in here set up the X and Y value where I'm going to draw that box based on the column number and the row number, and column going sideways, rows going down, and then the width and the height I got from the lengths. So that's trivial, so I'm not going to talk about that. That's not important to how I'm using the list. Okay, so I need to explain how it could not be written. So I have a good part where it manages complexity, but then I have to talk about how it could not be written, or it would have to be written if it did not use a list. Okay, so if the programmer wanted to change the grid to a different layout, it's easy to modify the grid assignment starting on line 40, without a list, a collection. But I'm thinking without a collection, the programmer would have to go through and find certain boxes from a straight sequence, no loops, no ifs or anything, of, what is it, 5 by 5, so 25 or more lines of code to draw a 5 by 5 grid, or add and subtract, or add or delete lines if the grid dimensions change. Okay, so that looks good. I'm going to triple check my spelling. So tools, spelling grammar, spell check of the grid. You can get away with this. I might get away with this because I want to limit my word count, so I can have some bad grammar here and there to have less word count. But let's check my word count. So what was it? Control Shift C in Chrome and Google. So 139, 140. I don't know if that counts, but it's still 140. And this has to be 45, so that's 185 total. And it has to be less than 200 or less, not more than 200. Okay. So it looks good. I give it another read through, but I think that's it for part B. And then when I'm done, of course, I'd go to the scoring guideline. Maybe the next day, I'd go to the scoring guidelines. I'd say, okay, what points do I get if I want to get this point? So I'd probably zoom in a bit because I have bad eyesight. I'd say, okay, point for row 3, for row 2. Okay, so do I include 2 programmer segments? Check mark. Do I identify the name? Check mark. Do I do this? Check mark. Okay, that's that point. Do I do this? Yes. Do I do that? Yes. Triple check the decision rules. So don't just write it and say, okay, I'm done. Go back and score your own written response. And if you need to, you can change some code to make it work better or to have more of the requirements. You can change your response you wrote here. You don't have to have just the first draft. And actually what I'm doing, I'm just reading off what I already wrote, and I've been making improvements. So this is not just my first draft. I have my first draft on another screen, and this is actually a better written response than what I had. So never settle for your first response. Always do better because you want to get 100%, you want to get that 5.